Los Angeles, March 1975. The offices of Meridian Pictures were buzzing with nervous energy. Michael Caine was there to discuss his role in The Man Who Would Be King, John Huston's ambitious adaptation of the Rudyard Kipling story. But what should have been a routine meeting about script changes would become the day that changed how an entire studio approached diversity in casting. The meeting was being held in the lavish conference room of studio head Marcus Whitman, a man whose influence stretched across Hollywood like a shadow. Whitman had built Meridian into one of the most profitable studios in town through a combination of commercial savvy and ruthless business practices. He was also, as many in Hollywood knew but few dared to say openly, a man whose views on race belonged to a previous century. Present in the room were Caine, director John Huston, producer John Foreman, and several studio executives. They were discussing the casting of supporting roles when Whitman made a comment that would haunt him for the rest of his career. "I'm concerned about some of these casting choices," Whitman said, flipping through the proposed cast list. "Too many ethnic faces. This is supposed to be a prestige picture, not some social experiment." The room went quiet. Huston, a legendary director known for his integrity, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The other executives suddenly found their papers very interesting. "What do you mean by ethnic faces?" Caine asked quietly. Whitman looked up from his papers, apparently unaware of the line he was about to cross. "You know what I mean, Michael. We've got Syed Jaffrey proposed for the Guru, some other Indian actor for the Merchant. I understand the story is set in India, but our audience doesn't want to see too many foreign faces. It makes them uncomfortable." Caine's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. "I see. And what would you suggest instead?" "Well," Whitman said, warming to his theme, "we could use makeup like we always have, get some good character actors, darken them up a bit. Much more palatable for American audiences." The suggestion hung in the air like smoke. What Whitman was proposing wasn't just casting choices, it was the systematic exclusion of talented actors based solely on their ethnicity, replaced by white actors in makeup. John Huston finally spoke up. "Marcus, the story is set in British India. It would be absurd not to cast actual Indian actors." "John," Whitman interrupted, "you're a brilliant director, but you don't understand the business side. We need to think about box office, about what audiences will accept. Too much authenticity can hurt a picture commercially." Caine set down his script and looked directly at Whitman. "Marcus, can I tell you something?" "Of course. I just came back from filming The Wilby Conspiracy in Kenya. Spent 3 months there working with local actors, local crew members. Some of the most talented people I've ever worked with." Whitman nodded politely, not seeing where this was going. There was one actor in particular, a Kenyan named Samuel Mwangi, classically trained, spoke 4 languages, had more stage experience than half the actors in Hollywood. He auditioned for a small role as a village elder. Caine's voice remained conversational, but there was something building underneath. The original director wanted to give him the part immediately, said he was perfect for it, brought exactly the authenticity and gravitas the role required. But the studio, an American studio like yours, said no. "Well," Whitman said defensively, "these decisions are complex. They said no," Caine continued, "because they didn't think American audiences were ready to see a black African actor in anything more than a servant role. So they hired a British character actor, put him in blackface, and had him play the part. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. The result was embarrassing," Caine said. "A caricature instead of a character, a mockery instead of a performance." And meanwhile Samuel Mwangi went back to his job as a schoolteacher. His talent completely wasted because of someone's assumptions about what audiences would accept. Whitman was starting to look uncomfortable. "Michael, I understand your point, but do you?" Caine interrupted. "Because right now you're suggesting we do exactly the same thing. You want to take roles written for Indian characters and give them to white actors in makeup because you think audiences are too racist to accept authentic casting." The word racist hung in the air like an accusation. No one in Hollywood used that word lightly, especially not when talking to studio heads. "Now wait just a minute," Whitman said, his face reddening. "I'm not racist, I'm being practical. I'm thinking about what's commercially viable." "And what exactly makes Indian actors commercially unviable?" Caine asked. Whitman struggled for an answer. Well, they're unknown. Audiences don't connect with unfamiliar faces. Were Sean Connery and I unknown when we started? Was every actor unknown before they became known? Caine leaned forward in his chair. Or is it that you think white audiences can't identify with non-white characters? That they're incapable of seeing past skin color to the human story underneath? I don't think audiences are ready. Audiences are ready for whatever we give them, as long as it's good, Caine said firmly. You're not protecting audiences from something they can't handle. You're protecting your own prejudices by disguising them as business concerns. The other executives in the room were staring at their hands, clearly wishing they were anywhere else. But here's what really bothers me about your approach, Caine continued. You're not just hurting actors like Sadi Jaffrey by denying them opportunities. You're hurting the film itself. Whitman looked confused. How is casting established actors hurting the film? Because authenticity matters, Caine explained. When you cast an actual Indian actor as an Indian character, you get cultural knowledge, linguistic accuracy, emotional truth that no amount of makeup can replicate. You get nuances and insights that come from lived experience. He gestured toward the script. The Man Who Would Be King isn't just an adventure story. It's about the collision between British colonialism and Indian culture. It's about two worlds meeting and misunderstanding each other. If you cast white actors as Indian characters, you're literally recreating the colonial mindset that the story is examining. Houston was nodding vigorously. This was exactly what he had been trying to explain to the studio for months. Moreover, Caine continued, you're cheating audiences out of discovering new talent. Some of the most memorable performances in film history have come from unknown actors who brought something unique to roles written for their backgrounds. Whitman tried a different approach. Look, Michael, I respect your artistic vision, but I have shareholders to answer to, investors who expect returns. Marcus, Caine said, cutting him off. Let me ask you a direct question. Do you believe that non-white actors are inherently less talented than white actors? Of course not. Do you believe that audiences are inherently more racist than they were 10 years ago? No, Then why are you making casting decisions based on the assumption that both of those things are true? Whitman opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. He had been caught in the logic of his own position. The truth is, Caine said, his voice gaining intensity, you're not making business decisions. You're making comfortable decisions. You're choosing the familiar over the authentic because it requires less courage, less trust in your audience's intelligence and humanity. He stood up and walked to the window overlooking the studio lot. But comfort is the enemy of great filmmaking. The best films push boundaries, challenge assumptions, make audiences think and feel in new ways. You can't do that if you're constantly second-guessing their capacity for growth. Caine turned back to face the room. I've worked on films all over the world. London, Kenya, Germany, Italy. And you know what I've learned? Talent is universal. Stories are universal. The human experience transcends race and nationality and cultural background. But you'll never discover that if you keep casting white actors to play everyone. The passion in his voice was unmistakable now. When you deny opportunities to actors based on their ethnicity, you're not just being unfair to them, you're depriving audiences of stories and performances they never knew they wanted. You're limiting the scope of human experience that cinema can explore. Whitman was shifting uncomfortably in his chair, clearly unused to being challenged so directly. And frankly, Caine continued, you're being incredibly short-sighted from a business perspective. The world is becoming more connected, more international. If Hollywood doesn't start reflecting that diversity, it's going to be left behind by cinemas that do. He sat back down and looked directly at Whitman. So here's what I'm proposing. Cast the best actors for these roles, regardless of their ethnicity. Trust your audience to connect with good performances and good storytelling, and see what happens when you stop underestimating both your artists and your viewers. The room was completely silent. Whitman looked around at the other faces, Huston's hopeful expression, the executive's uncomfortable avoidance of eye contact, Caine's steady, challenging gaze. Finally, Whitman spoke, his voice much quieter than before. What if you're wrong? What if audiences don't respond well to unfamiliar faces? Then we'll deal with that when it happens, Caine replied. But what if you're wrong about audiences? What if they're more open-minded and curious than you think? What if they're hungry for authentic stories told by authentic voices? He leaned forward. Isn't it worth finding out? Isn't it worth the risk to make a better film? Whitman was quiet for a long moment, processing everything he had heard. The other men in the room waited, understanding that this was a pivotal moment not just for this film but potentially for the studio's entire approach to casting. You know, Whitman said slowly, I've been in this business for 25 years. I've always prided myself on being practical, on making decisions based on data and experience. He paused. But maybe I've been too comfortable with old data, old experiences. Maybe I've been making decisions based on assumptions rather than evidence. Caine remained silent, letting Whitman work through his thoughts. All right, Whitman said finally. We'll cast the roles authentically. We'll trust the audience to appreciate good storytelling regardless of who's telling the story. The relief in the room was palpable. Huston smiled for the first time all morning, but Whitman continued, if this doesn't work commercially, if audiences reject the film because of the casting choices, then we'll have learned something important, Caine said. And we'll adjust accordingly, but at least we'll have tried to make the best possible film rather than the safest possible film. Whitman nodded slowly. Fair enough. The meeting concluded with concrete plans to proceed with authentic casting. Saad Jaffrey was confirmed for the role of the Guru, along with several other Indian actors in supporting roles. The film would be made as Huston had envisioned it, with respect for the cultural authenticity of the story. The Man Who Would Be King went on to become both a critical and commercial success. The performances by the Indian actors were universally praised, with several critics specifically noting how their authenticity enhanced the film's themes about cultural collision and understanding. More importantly, the film's success helped establish a precedent at Meridian Pictures and other studios. Authentic casting became not just an artistic choice but a commercially viable one, opening doors for actors from diverse backgrounds who had previously been excluded from major productions. Years later, when asked about the film's impact on his career, Saad Jaffrey would say, Michael Caine didn't just get me a role that day. He opened a door for an entire generation of actors who had been told their faces didn't belong on American screens. Marcus Whitman never publicly discussed the details of that March meeting, but his actions spoke louder than words. Over the following decade, Meridian Pictures became known for its diverse casting and international productions, discovering and promoting talent from around the world. In 1985, 10 years after The Man Who Would Be King, Whitman established the Meridian International Fellowship, a program that brought actors, directors, and writers from developing countries to Hollywood for training and collaboration opportunities. The program's mission statement read, in part, great storytelling knows no boundaries of race, nationality, or cultural background. This fellowship exists to discover and nurture talent wherever it may be found. When asked about his motivation for creating the program, Whitman was characteristically brief. I learned that assumptions about audience limitations often reflect the limitations of the people making the assumptions. This program exists to challenge those limitations. If you've ever witnessed discrimination disguised as practical business decisions, if you've ever seen talent dismissed because it doesn't fit preconceived notions of what audiences want, Michael Caine's confrontation with Marcus Whitman reminds us that courage isn't just about standing up to obvious villains. Sometimes it's about challenging well-meaning people to examine their assumptions and do better. That the most powerful changes often come not from dramatic gestures, but from patient, persistent arguments for authenticity, fairness, and trust in human nature's capacity for growth. The ripple effects of that March day in 1975 extended far beyond Meridian Pictures, or even The Man Who Would Be King. Word of Caine's stand against discriminatory casting practices spread quickly through Hollywood's tight-knit community, carried by the executives and agents who had witnessed or heard about the confrontation. Within weeks, other studios began quietly examining their own casting practices. The entertainment trade papers started running articles about authentic casting and international talent development. What had been an isolated incident became part of a broader conversation about representation and opportunity in American cinema. The change wasn't immediate or universal. Many studio executives remained wedded to traditional approaches, continuing to prioritize familiar faces over authentic casting. But Caine's arguments had introduced a new framework for thinking about these decisions, one that framed diversity not as a concession to political correctness, but as a path to artistic excellence and commercial success. John Huston, energized by the victory at Meridian, began actively seeking projects that would showcase international talent. His subsequent films featured increasingly diverse casts, and he became known as a director who could successfully blend authentic cultural elements with mainstream commercial appeal. Michael's intervention that day didn't just save The Man Who Would Be King, Huston said in a 1978 interview. It reminded me why I got into this business in the first place, to tell human stories that transcend the artificial boundaries we create between cultures and peoples. The success of The Man Who Would Be King provided concrete evidence for Caine's arguments about audience readiness for diverse casting. The film's box office performance was strong both domestically and internationally, and critics consistently praised the authenticity that the Indian actors brought to their roles. Roger Ebert wrote in his review, "What makes The Man Who Would Be King special is its refusal to condescend to either its characters or its audience. By casting actual Indian actors as Indian characters, the film achieves a cultural authenticity that serves both the story and the performances." This critical reception became ammunition for other directors and producers who wanted to pursue authentic casting but faced resistance from studio executives. They could point to The Man Who Would Be King as proof that audiences not only accepted but appreciated diverse representation when it served the story. The film's success also had a profound impact on the careers of the Indian actors who had been cast. Said Jaffrey parlayed his role into a series of international productions, becoming one of the first Indian actors to achieve genuine crossover success in Western cinema. Other actors from the film found increased opportunities in both British and American productions, but perhaps more importantly, their success created a pathway for future generations of actors from diverse backgrounds. Casting directors began actively seeking out authentic performers for roles that had previously been given to white actors in makeup, recognizing that authenticity often translated into more compelling performances. The change was particularly noticeable in period films and international productions. Studios that had once routinely cast white actors for roles set in Asia, Africa, or Latin America began hiring actors from those regions, discovering in the process that authentic casting often provided cultural insights that improved the films themselves. Marcus Whitman's personal transformation became equally significant within industry circles. Colleagues watched with interest as the traditionally conservative studio head began championing diverse projects and international co-productions. His conversion from skeptic to advocate carried particular weight because of his reputation as a hard-headed businessman. If Marcus Whitman thinks diverse casting is profitable, one studio executive was quoted as saying, "Then maybe we need to reconsider our own approaches." This business-focused argument for diversity proved particularly persuasive with executives who might have resisted appeals based solely on fairness or artistic integrity. Whitman had essentially provided a conservative case for progressive casting practices. The Meridian International Fellowship, established in 1985, became a model for other industry diversity programs. Over its first decade, the program brought more than 200 international artists to Hollywood, many of whom went on to successful careers that bridged their home countries and the American market. One particularly successful fellow was Nigerian director Adebayo Akinfenwa, who came to Hollywood in 1987 and eventually directed several major studio productions. In a 2010 interview, he credited the fellowship with changing his life. "The program didn't just give me technical training, it gave me access to a system that had previously been closed to people like me." Michael Caine's stand in 1975 created opportunities that are still reverberating today. The fellowship also had an unexpected effect on Hollywood's understanding of international markets. As the program fellows returned to their home countries with Hollywood experience, they became bridges between American studios and emerging film industries around the world. This cultural exchange proved invaluable as studios increasingly sought to tap into global markets. By the 1990s, the principles that Caine had articulated in that conference room had become mainstream industry practice. Authentic casting was no longer seen as a risky artistic choice, but as a standard expectation. Films that failed to cast authentically were increasingly criticized by both critics and audiences. The change was particularly evident in how Hollywood approached adaptations of international literature or films set in foreign countries. Where once studios might have automatically cast American or British actors regardless of setting, they now actively sought performers from the appropriate cultural backgrounds. This shift contributed to the rise of what critics called authentic internationalism in American cinema, films that genuinely reflected the global nature of their stories rather than simply imposing Western perspectives on international settings. Michael Caine himself continued to champion these principles throughout his career. When offered roles that required him to play characters of different ethnicities, he consistently declined, arguing that such parts should go to actors from those backgrounds. His refusal to participate in what he called cultural masquerading helped establish new ethical standards for casting practices. In interviews, he would often refer back to that 1975 meeting as a turning point in his understanding of his responsibilities as a successful actor. Once you reach a certain level in this industry, you have influence whether you want it or not. The question is how you use that influence. Do you use it to perpetuate the same old limitations, or do you use it to expand possibilities for everyone? The story of his confrontation with Whitman became industry legend, told and retold in film schools and industry gatherings as an example of how individual courage could create systemic change. The specific details varied in different tellings, but the core message remained consistent, that challenging discriminatory practices wasn't just about fairness, it was about making better films. When The Man Who Would Be King was selected for preservation in the National Film Registry in 2010, the Library of Congress citation specifically mentioned the film's groundbreaking approach to authentic casting that helped establish new standards for cultural representation in American cinema. At the preservation ceremony, Michael Caine spoke about the film's legacy. "We made that film to tell an exciting adventure story, but it became something more, proof that audiences are smarter and more open-minded than the industry often assumes. That taking risks with casting can pay off not just artistically but commercially." He paused, looking out at the audience of film industry professionals. "Most importantly, it proved that our responsibility as filmmakers isn't just to entertain audiences, but to expand their horizons, to introduce them to faces and voices and perspectives they might not encounter in their daily lives. That's not political correctness. That's the fundamental promise of cinema as an art form." The principles established through that 1975 confrontation continue to influence casting practices today. While challenges remain and progress isn't always consistent, the basic understanding that authentic representation improves both artistic quality and commercial appeal has become embedded in industry thinking. Modern discussions about diversity in Hollywood often reference The Man Who Would Be King as an early example of how authentic casting can enhance rather than compromise commercial filmmaking. The film's success provided a template that subsequent generations of filmmakers have built upon and expanded. For emerging actors from underrepresented backgrounds, the story serves as a reminder that change is possible, that individual voices can make a difference, and that the industry's capacity for growth depends on people willing to challenge its limitations. The lesson remains relevant in any industry or institution where assumptions about audience readiness or market limitations are used to justify exclusion, that challenging those assumptions isn't just morally right. It often leads to better outcomes for everyone involved. Michael Caine's willingness to confront Marcus Whitman in 1975 didn't just save specific roles for specific actors. It helped establish the principle that artistic excellence and cultural authenticity could coexist with commercial success, creating opportunities for countless performers whose talents might otherwise have been overlooked. And it proved that sometimes the most powerful way to fight discrimination isn't through protests or petitions, but through patient, logical arguments that help people understand that doing the right thing is also doing the smart thing.